Hi everyone, thank you for joining me for the Features of Assessment for Math Instruction put on by the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project. We're going to be looking at different elements of assessment in a multi-tiered system of support. Our goals for this session is to understand the differences among various assessments used in the MTSS system, to identify the assessment your school uses and their purpose, with specific attention to how you can use them in your classroom, the Tier 1, and to determine if the assessments used at your school are the best fit for the purpose. At the end of this module, there'll be a coaching activity that can be found in the implementation resource folder that you can use as an assessment inventory to determine if the assessments being used are the best fit. It's called the who, what, when, where, why, and how of assessments, which is the assessment inventory. And it's a great follow-up activity that can be guided by a facilitation lead. Multi-tiered System of Support, or MTSS, integrates assessment and intervention within a school-wide multi-level prevention system to maximize student achievement and reduce behavior concerns. The multi-level prevention system builds upon a strong core, yet in mathematics, there has been no significant change in average mathematics scores for 4th or 8th graders compared to 2015 NAEP scores, and there's been a decrease in scores for lower performing 4th and 8th grade students compared to the NAEP scores in 2015, meaning many students struggle in mathematics, not just those identified as needing tiered instruction. So we, as general educators, need to understand how to support all of our learning and our learners in the Tier 1 setting, identify their needs, and monitor their progress to build a stronger core instruction. You may be familiar with the graphic on the left from various RTI and/or MTSS frameworks. Within a multi-level prevention system, there are typically at least 3 tiers of instruction and intervention. As students are moved from one tier to the next in a flexible way, it is important to remember the more intense the need, the more intense the service and support needs to be. At all levels, instructional decisions must be made based on solid data, which requires appropriate use of assessments. Today, we will focus on a general overview of assessments with particular attention to the use of various assessments in Tier 1. But we will also want to be thinking about the use of these assessments for our struggling learners in Tier 2 and 3 as well. Tier 1 is provided for all students with a goal of effective implementation and responsiveness for approximately 80% of our students, compared to Tier 2, which is provided for approximately 20% of students that struggle beyond grade level core instruction. And then we move to our Tier 3, which is our most intense, and it's provided for about 3 to 5% of our students that are not responsive to standard approaches and need individualization of content. This slide shows common types of assessments: formative, diagnostic, and summative, and the various times within instruction we use these types of assessments. In the next slides, we'll be going more in depth into each of these common types, specifically starting with formative assessment. What is formative assessment? It's an assessment for learning. They're brief measures of direct student performance, typically administered to all students during benchmarking and some students for progress monitoring. There are formal and informal versions of formative assessment. Formative assessments are iterative, meaning they're administered throughout instruction to help guide instructional decisions. Why do we use formative assessment? It's an identification of students who are non-responsive to instruction or intervention. It helps us determine response to current instruction, whether we're talking about Tier 1 core instruction or we're talking about more intensive supports in terms of Tier 2 or individualized supports for Tier 3 interventions. It can be used to identify students who are not responsive and to understand rates of improvement, often not used for grading purposes, but more of a guide to the effectiveness of instruction and whether changes or adjustments are needed. They're also supportive of curriculum and instructional decisions, program evaluation, resource allocation in a proactive model, comparison of instruction and intervention quality and efficacy. These formal and informal formative assessments are generally brief measures of direct student performance. Informal assessments are content and performance driven, whereas formal assessments have data that support the conclusions made from the test, including evidence of reliability and validity, measures of bias and distortion. There are also typically standardized in scoring and administration. Measures of reliability refers to the extent in which the score is accurate and consistent, and the extent to which the slope of improvement accurately represents rates of improvement. Measures of validity refer to the extent to which the score represents the underlying construct, meaning the accuracy of the assessment. Does it measure what it's supposed to measure? And the extent to which the slope of improvement corresponds to end level performance on highly valued outcomes, such as state math assessments and so on. The formal, valid, reliable, and standardized assessments have been tried before on students and have outcomes that support the conclusions that when a student is responding or performing well on the assessment, that they are not at risk, and that students performing below certain cut scores or points on the assessment are at risk. Scores such as percentiles, stand-ins, or standard scores are commonly received as part of this type of formal assessment. Compared to the informal assessment, these are often teacher-made. Exit slips, observations, interviews, running records, quizzes, and so forth. These help to determine on a day-to-day, quick, informal basis how students are responding to instruction. Diving a little bit deeper into formative assessments, on this slide we're specifically looking at informal formative assessments. These can be used to help teachers quickly determine what to teach and help in the selection of appropriate instructional strategies and supports. These are often mastery measures of proficiency of a specific skill rather than global indicators. They're often not monitoring the maintenance of skills, meaning checking back on skills after they've been taught, instructed, or intervened on. These informal assessments can be used diagnostically to help teachers determine how to adjust their instruction based on student need before getting to a summative assessment. In the first example of a multiplication running record, the teacher can really dig into what the student knows and what the student may not know. Do they have strategies to solve these problems? Can they immediately recall with fluency these multiplication facts, or are there specific ones that they struggle? Are they continuously counting on their fingers and counting up, or do they have other strategies that they use? Compared to the second example, which are exit slips, these can be given to a whole group of students. They can happen really quickly, informally, and don't need extensive amounts of time ahead to plan. Both examples can provide you really valuable information about what a student knows and struggles with. In both examples, it requires the educators to look past the correct and incorrect answers and really try to look for the processes the students use to understand their thinking. Let's look at some examples of informal formative assessments that can be used to gauge how students are doing within daily core instruction. Now we'll be digging into two specific types of formal formative assessment. The first being screening. Are students at risk for poor learning outcomes? And the second, progress monitoring. How are they responding to instruction? When discussing various assessments, including screening and progress monitoring, they can both be norm referenced and criteria referenced, depending on what information you're trying to gather. Determining the type of assessment used oftentimes is not measured by the look of the assessment, but more about how the scores are calculated and reported. A norm reference assessment is a student is measured against those taking the test, not against any defined criteria. It permits a fixed proportion of students to pass and fail. Because there are differences in the students taking the test from year to year, the standards that are set vary. Many tests provide national or state norms that have been derived from formal norming studies. Local norms can also be established using statistical methods. This normed information really helps us get a sense of how students are responding to instruction. Is it typical compared to their peers or a certain group of students, or is it not? Compared to criterion referenced assessments, these are used to identify a student's specific strengths and weaknesses in relation to an age or a grade level standard. It does not compare students with other students. The standards do not change because the criteria typically do not vary from year to year. There are multiple ways to determine the criteria that are used. They can be specific standards in a unit, a set of skills expected to be learned by a certain point. For example, by the winter of fourth grade, how is my student doing on grade level standards? This will not tell you how the student is doing compared to other fourth grade students. A real life example I like to think about for criterion referenced assessments is if you've ever been to a carnival or an amusement park, think about the signs that read, "You must be this tall to ride the ride," with an arrow pointing to a specific line on a height chart. The line indicated by the arrow functions as the criterion. The ride operator compares each person's height against it before allowing them to get on the ride. If you're interested in knowing how a student compares with other students in the screening process, you would probably be most interested in a norm referenced assessment. Compared to if you want to screen for which students met or did not meet a set of criterion, typically a score, then you would be interested in a criterion referenced assessment. Again, some assessments can be both norm referenced and criteria referenced. It doesn't depend on the look of the assessment, it's more about how the scores are reported. Now, let's dive deeper into a specific formal formative assessment called screening, also sometimes referred to as the universal screening. The purpose of screening is to identify those students who are at risk for poor learning outcomes. It's used to designate students who might be in need of closer monitoring in their general education curriculum or of a more intense intervention. Tools in an MTSS framework are typically standardized, validated, and reliable measures of formative assessment. We briefly described validity and reliability, but to find out more information or determine if the tools that you're using is valid and reliable, you can visit the National Center on Intensive Interventions tools chart at intensiveintervention.org. Screening occurs multiple times a year and can be used to determine students that are at risk for poor learning outcomes. It can be used to support evaluation program effectiveness, establish local norms and cut scores, and also provide data for next year's teachers. All students should take universal screening, and it's recommended at least 3 times per year. Remember, just because a student falls below the cut score on a screen does not mean they definitely will need more intensive supports, such as a Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention. The screener is a great starting point, but we may need to provide more progress monitoring data to determine if they are truly at risk. In the next slide, we will review the uses and purpose for universal screening in more detail. Purpose of universal screening and how do we use universal screening in schools? The purpose is to identify who is struggling, which students require further follow-up to determine the level of support that they need. It also provides schools, grade levels, and class data about the distribution of students across the tiers. Are approximately 80% of students responding to core instruction, and how has that changed over the course of the year? On the slide, you can see the graph image on the left for the fall, winter, and spring to see how that percentage has changed over time. Another example is in the winter, we can identify which students are on track to meet the end of year benchmark. We can use it to identify students that might have begun struggling, but were not necessarily at risk in the fall, and we can determine whether students are responding to current interventions. Compared to in the spring, we can use the universal screening data to document students' end of year performance and identify which students might benefit from additional instruction over the summer or at the start of the following school year. So universal screening data can be used for multiple purposes depending on what time of year you are looking at the data. In the following video, principals will share their perspective on the importance of screening from their experience and how screening systems and processes are used in their school to identify students most at risk for learning outcomes.
For us, there's kind of the practical piece of universal screening and then the piece that works for the kid. Ultimately, it all works for the kid, but we have to start somewhere. We have to know who needs the help. For us as a magnet school, a 6, 7, 8 magnet school, when our 6th graders come to us, they can come from some 40-something elementary schools. And we don't necessarily own them. They didn't necessarily come to us from one of our other magnet schools in our capital region area. They could have come from almost anywhere. So we really know little about them. So it is critical, that universal screening component is critical, and there comes the practical piece to really know where do our students stand and who needs some sort of help in what area. So that's very critical for us to have. And then, of course, from grade to grade, we need to figure out where everyone is. And I think at that point, that's where progress monitoring sort of starts to take over as we track where students are along the spectrum. But as things change, in particular as units in math change, as the complexity of reading increases as you go from one grade to another, you still can't forget about those universal screens that may scoop up some students who you missed before because they were making it with their understanding on one level, but now the bar got raised and now they're falling behind. So you have to maintain your universal screens because it allows you to truly identify the students who you need to get into your program.
In our universal screening, it again is very much, we need to somewhere kind of filter out the kids that do need help and do not need, they're already benchmark students, which are on grade level. And so I think the universal screening, it just really helps us say, okay, we know that some students are going to need interventions, and that initial universal screening will tell us who needs the interventions, and then we can take those and decide which path they need to do. We can do some more individual diagnostic testing to see which path they really need to follow. And then that's where we break out into different interventions depending on what the diagnostics show.
I see the importance of screening being that how else will you know if you have any students falling through the cracks? It's so easy to hide in the masses of students in a classroom that is treated as a classroom and not as individuals, that the screening is key to finding those students that otherwise wouldn't show up.
Screening is probably the most critical piece, because if we don't screen, we have no way of knowing whether we have a class-wide problem or we have an individual student problem. And the interventions are so different. So that's really critical for us.
Screening isn't always black and white. As we previously stated, during screening, just because a student is identified as being at risk may not necessarily mean they need secondary intervention supports. Screening students to determine risk can result in 4 possible categories. The first category being students that are true positives, meaning these are students that truly are at risk of not meeting the end of year benchmarks or standards when provided high quality Tier 1 instruction. These are students that will need intervention on foundational skills in addition to scaffolds, differentiation, and supports during the Tier 1 instruction. Compared to our true negative students, these are students that we identified as not being at risk and truly do not need intervention supports beyond scaffolds, differentiation, and instruction in the Tier 1 setting. From there, we start to get into the gray area of screening. Types B, false positives, and C, false negatives. The first type of error is false positives, in which children who eventually become academically competent score below the cut point on the screening tool. So educators therefore consider them to be at risk. According to Fletcher et al. And Jenkins and O'Connor, false positives undermine prevention by stressing school resources to provide Tier 2 intervention to an inflated percentage of students. The second type of error is false negatives. These are children who score above the cut score on a predictive instrument, but who later develop academic problems. A classification process that produces large numbers of false negatives diminish the effects of prevention efforts by depriving at-risk students of the early intervention that they require. All screening measures will misidentify some students as either needing assistance when they do not, false positives, or needing assistance when they do, false negatives. When screening students, educators will want to maximize both the number of students correctly identified as at risk, also known as a measure sensitivity, and the number of students correctly identified as not at risk, a measure specificity. These measures depend on the cut score used to classify children at risk. Schools that set a cut score too high run the risk of spending resources on students who do not need help, and schools that set a cut score too low run the risk of not providing intervention to students who are at risk and need extra instruction. If a school or district consistently finds that students receiving intervention do not need it, the measurement team should consider lowering the cut score. To maximize the number of students correctly identified, schools often refer to a multi-gated system that looks at progress monitoring and other sources of assessment data to confirm the student's need for additional supports outside of Tier 1 core instruction. For the false positive students, classroom data such as informal and formal assessments, including unit assessments, teacher-made quizzes, and exit slips, can support accurate identification by showing that the student has competencies in grade level skills. Educators will want to continuously progress monitor these students to ensure they don't have a regression or slide in their skills. In a later slide, we'll come back to this idea of false positives and negatives and share some examples of how schools try to maximize their identification during screening using various summative assessments. Now, I would like you to take a moment, pause the video, and reflect on screening in your school and classroom. What type of screening tool do you use, and when do you use it? How is it used to identify students at risk for math difficulties? Do you use it? Is it used by a team, by the whole school, or by certain individuals? And what do you like about your screening tool, or what do you dislike about your screening tool? Pause the video now. We just reviewed universal screening. Another type of formative assessment is progress monitoring. Let's dive deeper into the components of progress monitoring now. What is progress monitoring? It is a standardized method of ongoing assessment. They are brief, repeated assessment measures that capture student learning or behavior over time. Why would we progress monitor? During core instruction, Tier 1, teachers are often using informal measures to monitor their students' progress and inform the need for instructional changes and support on grade level standards. Whereas during secondary interventions, Tier 2 and 3, tools for progress monitoring are typically standardized, scientifically validated, reliable formative assessments. These tools report measures of grade, age, or instructionally appropriate normed outcomes. Progress monitoring helps confirm and compare the efficiency of different forms of instruction and facilitate instructional planning. It allows teams to measure student response, progress toward meeting student academic and behavior goals, and to identify students not making progress, which allows us to determine when an instructional change is needed and to help hypothesize potential sources of need. Formal tools allow accurate and meaningful information regarding students' need, which allows teams to measure students' response, evaluate growth, set specific goals, and determine appropriate rates of improvement. On this slide, these are examples of various progress monitoring tools. Selecting the most relevant tool for student need is key, and it's essential to monitor as close to grade level content as appropriate. There is a difference between progress monitoring and monitoring progress. As discussed in the previous slide, we're often using informal formative assessments in the Tier 1 setting to monitor students' progress. Those are a variety of techniques that teachers use to determine the students' progress on a day-to-day basis, such as quizzes, exit slips, running records, samples, anecdotal records, those kinds of things. Whereas progress monitoring are more formal formative assessment measures used on an ongoing basis. They're evidence-based to determine rate of growth for students. Things such as STAR, Easy CBMs, MBSP, and DIBELS Next are all examples of formal formative assessments for progress monitoring. When progress monitoring, there are two main types that we refer to in the MTSS RTI framework: general outcome measures and mastery measures. We will discuss these two main types in the next two slides. When providing students with formalized intervention plans, we want to more formally monitor their progress to ensure they are responding or not to the instruction. When monitoring progress more formally, we often use general outcome measures, which answer the questions: are students growing? Are they making progress on global indicators of competencies or curriculum sampling, rather than just on one specific skill? These short, quick assessments are repeatedly administered, and the data collected allows measurement of growth over time because students are being assessed using assessments with comparable items. The assessments are probes of equal difficulty throughout the year, so it provides an opportunity to monitor students' maintenance of skills to ensure they do not have regression. When monitoring students' progress, which is often more informal, we often use mastery measures. What do we use mastery measures for? We use mastery measures to determine students' proficiency of a specific skill in a sequence. Look at the graphic on the left of this slide. The student was first monitored on their mastery of multi-digit addition before moving on to the mastery of multi-digit subtraction with the goal of getting to multiplication facts. The student did not move on to the subtraction until multi-digit addition was consistently at or above the mastery level. This type of measure does not monitor maintenance of skills. So to determine if the student continues to have addition mastered after moving on to subtraction, the educator would need to periodically circle back to addition to recheck or monitor that skill as well. It becomes impossible to know whether after one skill has been taught, the student still remains and remembers how to perform the previously learned skill without monitoring that skill as well. In addition, how a student does on a mastery measure assessment does not indicate how he or she will do on standardized tests, because the number of objectives mastered does not typically relate well to performance on criterion measures. Some teacher-made, sometimes commercial, so reliability and validity vary depending on the measure. While teacher-made tests present concerns for evaluating growth and determining the appropriate rate of improvement given the unknown reliability and validity of these measures, there is increasing research demonstrating the validity and reliability of other measures in the area of mathematics. Mastery measures such as teacher-made assessment are often great resources for Tier 1 core instruction planning, but as students' needs increase in intensity, we want to use a more standardized method of ongoing assessment with strong validity and reliability to effectively evaluate responsiveness. For more information regarding general outcome measures and mastery measures, see the resource folder for tutorials. You may also visit intensiveintervention.org. This is the National Center on Intensive Intervention websites, and they have a tools chart that has academic progress monitoring ratings, both general outcome and mastery measures. They show ratings on various elements, including reliability, validity, number of alternate forms, rates of improvements, benchmarks, and sensitivity to student improvement. This tools chart is like a consumer report for progress monitoring tools. The tools may appear to have good ratings, but you have to do a little bit of investigation and research into the tools themselves to see if they are an appropriate fit for your population. Now, let's dig into diagnostic assessment. A student is consistently struggling and not responding to instruction as prescribed by the program or practice specificity. The next questions always become, what are they struggling with? Where are their gaps in understanding? And why are they not responding? This is when we can lean on diagnostic information. What is diagnostic assessment? Diagnostic assessments are often described by how we dig deeper into either formative or summative assessments to determine how to adjust our instruction. Why do we have diagnostic assessments? Because we want to measure a student's current knowledge and skills for the purpose of identifying a suitable program of learning. It can be used to identify areas of strengths and weaknesses for individual students, which can help teachers determine what to teach and help in the selection of appropriate interventions. When do we diagnostically assess? Diagnostic assessments do not need to be complete for all students, but you do want to purposely think about the reason for collecting diagnostic data, for which students and when. Diagnostic tools can be either informal, which are easy to use tools that can be administered with little training, or standardized, which must be delivered in a standard way by trained staff. Due to the amount of time to complete the formal standardized diagnostic assessments are used on an individualized basis. Formal standardized diagnostic assessments are generally administered to students when screening and progress monitoring data suggest non-response with the goal of identifying specific deficits in student learning so we can plan an appropriate intervention. These are various forms both behaviorally and academically, that can be used to help hypothesize how to change instruction in hopes of determining responsiveness. Let's dive a little deeper into diagnostic assessment. Diagnostic tools provide data to assist educators in designing individualized instruction and intensifying intervention for students who do not respond to instruction as prescribed by the program or practice specificity. Because diagnostic assessments provide detailed information about individual student learning, they are often most effective in understanding the needs of individual students rather than all students. When there is a need to dig deeper and gather more information regarding a student that is struggling, to answer the questions, why are they struggling and how deep are their gaps in understanding, we will administer diagnostic assessments. The first avenue is, though, informal assessments, which we will discuss in more detail on the next slide. Informal assessments are less time-consuming to dig into for multiple students compared to formal assessments. Formal diagnostic assessments are more time-consuming and are often administered on an individual basis, so these are often only administered to students not responding to intervention. When informal information and analysis of formative assessments does not provide enough detailed information. Do all students need individualized instruction in Tier 1? No, but for those struggling, do we need to do another assessment? No. The first line of defense is to use informal data from our classroom that we can use to determine student need before having to use an extensive formal diagnostic assessment. These are examples of informal diagnostic tools that can quickly support educators in the classroom, making instructional decisions about practices, scaffolds, and differentiated supports to provide to students in the classroom. After these informal diagnostics are used to inform instruction and support, the students continue to struggle, we would want to gather more formal diagnostic information. These more formal diagnostic assessments are therefore typically administered only to some students. Those that are consistently are non-responsive to instruction and need more information, or to have students who've been identified as being at risk for learning outcomes. This flowchart is a great example of a process to follow to diagnostically understand a student. Start with some exit tickets, observations, running records, quizzes you've made, and use them diagnostically. What concepts are the students struggling with? What skills? Is it the entire group or an individual? Do I need to circle back my teaching or revisit certain supports for specific students? And then if it becomes consistent and persistent struggles, are the students receiving intervention services? Are the struggles appropriate for grade level, or do we need more extensive information? When more information is needed on a student and informal assessments are not supporting a student's response to instruction, we can look at formative assessments students have taken and dig into them diagnostically. These are generally administered to students when progress monitoring data suggests non-response, with the goal of identifying specific deficits in student learning and planning instruction or an intervention. When using formative assessments diagnostically, we want to be sure that we consider students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds in the types of questions being asked for the students. We do not want this becoming a barrier in the assessment rather than being able to focus on the student's response to the math content. We want to ensure that the questions we're asking are relevant to the students. These is a list of formative assessments that we can use diagnostically, and it was adapted from the National Center on Intensive Intervention's website for examples of diagnostic tools. This is an example of error analysis of formative assessment data. This is common diagnostic approach that educators take in the Tier 1 general education setting. This could be an example of a student's practice problems, answers on a teacher-made assessment, or even the student response from a formal, standardized, valid, and reliable progress monitoring assessment that they are showing non-response to. In the example of Cole's problems analyzed, this could be used by a general educator to differentiate the instruction if the students are learning about regrouping and this content is grade level appropriate. They may need to provide Cole with more opportunities to regroup within place value using concrete and representations in connection to the subtraction standard algorithm. If Cole is a student above grade 3, he is going to need intervention in place value and regrouping in addition to supports and scaffolds within the classroom whenever students are applying the subtraction algorithm until he can accurately regroup and apply the standard algorithm or an accurate, efficient strategy. This is a great snapshot of how you can use your formative assessment data diagnostically to gather information and plan for instruction and intervention supports for a student without having to administer another assessment. If the informal diagnostics and use of formative assessment tools through the use of error analysis or student interviews did not provide enough detail, this is a list of more extensive tools that can provide detailed information on discrete skills and help students specific areas of strength and weakness. Due to the amount of time to complete, the formal standardized diagnostic assessments are not administered to all and are used on an individualized basis. These are typically only administered to students who have been identified as being at risk for learning problems and are non-responsive to Tier 2 intervention supports based on regular progress monitoring data. Many examples from this list came from the National Center on Intensive Intervention's website for examples of diagnostic tools. The last example, Some Diagnostic, is a tool that RIDE's Department of Curriculum, Assessment, and Instruction provided professional development opportunities to educators and districts around the state. Please see the Department of Education's website for more information. Now, I would like you to pause and reflect on progress monitoring. How are you currently using progress monitoring data to help drive your instruction? Are you progress monitoring or just monitoring progress? And which tools are you using? Are they formal, informal, or both? And how are you using them? Pause now. Summative assessments are often assessments typically used for accountability, resource allocation, and measure of mastery over time based on a set of standards. The goal is to evaluate student learning, proficiency, or success at the end of an instructional unit, course, or year by comparing it against a standard or benchmark. Evaluating the effectiveness of school improvement goals, curriculum alignment, and possibly even student placement in various programs, for example, accelerated or AP courses. Summative assessments happen too far down the learning path to provide information at the classroom level and to make instructional adjustments and interventions during the learning process. These help you inform how students did holistically over time and plan for future work, such as updates to curriculum, scope, sequence, pacing. Overall, how successful were students in each grade? Is there a specific grade or population that we need more specific information on to support them in the future work? There are two types of summative assessments. Curriculum assessments, which happen throughout the year based on a set of standards. How did the students do in Unit 2 multiplication strategies and fact fluency after 2 months of instruction with various lessons pertaining to multiplication. And then there are outcome assessments, are the other type of summative assessment that measures a student's learning over a course of the year compared to end-of-year benchmarks or standards. For example, by the end of 3rd grade, students should be able to represent and solve problems involving multiplication and division, understand properties of multiplication and the relationship between multiplication and division, multiply and divide within 100, solve problems involving the 4 operations, and identify and explain patterns in arithmetic, develop understanding of fractions as numbers, solve problems involving measurement and estimation of intervention, and many other 3rd grade Common Core standards. Summative assessments help us evaluate to see how those students did against those 3rd grade standards. Summative assessments, both curricular and outcome, can be beneficial data, 2nd level, as teams determine students' at-risk status for the following year. The summative assessments from previous instruction, or even the previous year, can help to confirm identification of risk and maximize the accuracy of identifications. These are not great initial predictors of risk status, as they only assess content from a specific grade level, but they can be beneficial as a 2nd level to support the identification from a universal screener. We want to use summative assessment data in connection with our screening data to determine the accuracy of our identification. Some schools have found that to help accurately classify students at risk, they're using a 2nd level screener. For example, a school might use a STAR Math screener as their initial screen and then gather more information regarding the false positives and false negatives by administering another assessment, MBSP or CBM, to students between a certain level, which in turn has helped them to more accurately classify their at-risk students, improve intervention effectiveness, and more adequately use resources and personnel at the school level. Now, all of the assessments, how does it work in a cycle? We have to put it all together at the school level. First, we screen students universally to identify risk. Again, we screen all students. Then we create instructional and intervention plans to support students identified at risk and progress monitor them regularly. We use all other formative assessment data, including progress monitoring, to confirm and support our identification of risk at the Tier 1 level. When more diagnostic information is needed to identify a student's level of need and create a specific instructional intervention plan, we can dig into formative assessments such as students' informal work or progress monitoring assessment responses to gather more information around the student's error and error patterns to plan additional supports. We continue to progress monitor the students identified to determine responsiveness and use diagnostic assessments when they are non-responsive to adjust the plan. Simultaneously, we are continuing to screen all students universally and use formative assessment data such as curricular assessments to support the student identification of risk. This cycle continues throughout the year. We identify risk, create a plan to provide instruction and intervention supports, progress monitor to determine responsiveness, use diagnostic data when needed to determine specific skill deficits and reasons for non-response to instruction, and assess outcomes and risk using progress monitoring data, universal screening results, and summative curricular assessments. Finally, as the year wraps up, there are the summative outcome assessments such as the state assessment RICAS or SATs for the secondary level, and we use that information in connection with our end-of-year screening data and student responsiveness based on progress monitoring data to determine how accurate we were with our initial risk identification, which students will continue to need intensive supports in the coming year, and where the district, school, and grade will need to focus their staffing and resources to support the achievement gap. We've talked about the common types of assessments: formative, diagnostic, and summative. Now let's look at key takeaways that you can use in your classroom on a day-to-day basis. So for formative, we have screening, which helps us determine risk, and progress monitoring, which helps us determine when we need to make instructional changes. For diagnostic, it helps us determine how to change our instruction. When using diagnostic assessments to determine how to change the instruction to support groups of students, first start with informal formative assessments. Progress monitor to determine responsiveness, and then use formal diagnostic on individual students that are consistently non-responsive. You may also use more formal diagnostics on individual students that are truly at risk, those true positives for not achieving academic outcomes. Remember, this is often a very small percentage of students. Lastly, our summative assessments. This is for true curricular and outcome assessments. It helps us determine if what we did worked over time. As described at the beginning of this presentation, there is a follow-up activity that can help you with your assessment inventory. It is found in the Google folder under Implementation Resources. As a team led by a facilitator, you will discuss which assessments you have, when you use them, and based on the learned information from this module, do you need to adjust anything? Thank you, and please feel free to reach out to your site liaison, coach, instructional lead, or any of us on the previous slide if you have any further questions or follow-up. Thank you.